Welcome. I'm Brantley Womack from the Politics Department and also the Miller Center. And I'd like to welcome you to another Zoom broadcast of a program sponsored by the East Asia Center and especially by its group that's studying the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that the presentation today is very important. But before then, I would like to make two infomercials. One of them for the East Asia Center and the other one for life in general. And the first one on the East Asia Center is that we will be sponsoring talks, and we'll continue to sponsor talks this semester. Next week, we'll have Ezra Vogel talking about his book on China and Japan. Week after that, we'll have another talk comparing historical governments in China and Japan. We have talks on art, literature, etc. So be sure, in these difficult days when you can't see a poster in the halls, be sure to continue to consult the East Asia Center's webpage for events that are coming up. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here since you all have found this event, but still I wanted to make that point. There's much of interest that is ahead of us as well. And the second more general point is vote. I don't want to sound like one of the presidential candidates in the debate this week, but I went to the Charlottesville county voting place today and found out it was very active, very friendly, very fast, very efficient, much better than a trip to Wegmans. It's really the convenience of voting early, and I hope the convenience and effectiveness of voting at the regular time in November 3rd should not be forgotten. And given that in one way or another, this will be a historic election, it's something that we all need to take our part in. Well, today's Zoom talk is by one of the most respected experts on China and Asia more generally. Evan Feigenbaum is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And there he oversees research that's going on not just in the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, but also in Beijing and New Delhi, on all of East Asia and South Asia. He's also, and the way that we met each other was last year, he was the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center. And so we met there. He has his PhD in Chinese politics from Stanford. But in his very packed career, he has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia. He's been on the policy planning staff with principal responsibility for East Asia and the Pacific, and an advisor to Robert Zoellick on Chinese affairs. Robert Zoellick, the author of China as Stakeholder, as well as president of the World Bank afterwards. So he's been active with the governments, he's not just focused on the US-China relationship the way we tend to be focused on that relationship. He's done work with the Indian government. He's done work with Kazakhstan, with Turkmenistan. He's been involved in policy in North and South Korea, Japan, and Australia. He has a breadth of background that is, I don't know if it's unique, but it certainly is unusual. And his talk today will center not just on that narrow, very, very important, but narrow business of how the US relates to China, or what Trump and what the differences between Trump and Biden might be, other than health at the moment. His interests are broader than that. And I think that China's relationships with the rest of Asia are the second most important diplomatic challenge and concern of world politics for the foreseeable future, after that bilateral relationship with the US and China, and they are interactive. So the type of background that Evan brings to the subject that he will address is a kind of background that we need. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, basically, Evan will present his talk for about 40 minutes or so. And I would ask you, as you have questions, to post them using the Q&A button at the bottom. Don't use the chat button, because that's harder to follow, and one button is much easier to deal with than several. I will collect these questions at the end of the talk, and then we'll go on to Q&A. And if I'm feeling bold, maybe I'll put the questions to people directly. And just a second. Otherwise, I'll unmute your connection, and so that you can ask the question directly. But first, let's hear what Evan has to say. So, Evan, it's up to you.
All right. Well, great. So, Brantley, first, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for being a great colleague and friend. Thanks to Dorothy and the East Asia Center. And thanks to everybody. I said to Brantley before the talk, I can't believe you all came out on a Friday afternoon in October. I know the pandemic has changed things, because normally people wouldn't be doing this. They'd be wandering around among the leaves. In any case, as Brantley said, I just finished up holding the Schlesinger Chair at the Miller Center. The chair's over. The pandemic made it hard to be in Charlottesville, so I regret that. But the good news is that Bill Antholis and the center decided to keep me around for a little while as a senior fellow. So hopefully when this is all behind us, I'll be able to come down and we'll be able to do this in person, have lunch, have coffee, and have more chances to talk about some of this stuff. Okay, now as Brantley said in the setup, he told me that the predominant focus of this audience was China's Belt and Road Initiative. And so what I thought I would do with this talk is to try to step back from that a little bit, and to try to help you set the discussion of that in the broader context of what I would say is 25 years of effort, including by the United States, to foster connectivity in Asia. And the broader lens is important, I think, because, to be frank with you, my own view is that a lot of people at this point tend to conflate the Belt and Road on the one hand with the issue of Eurasian connectivity itself. And they tend to do that really for two reasons. The first is, in some cases, people just don't know the longer and deeper history of connectivity initiatives in Asia that predate the Belt and Road. And they do have a long history, because the end of the Cold War, 22 years before the Belt and Road was launched in 2013, made cross-border trade and transit and capital flows possible to countries and from countries and across borders that had once been locked rather tightly to those opportunities. So there's that reason for the conflation. The second reason, to be frank, is that a lot of people, in my experience, just didn't pay a lot of attention to the issue of connectivity generally, particularly in the continental landmass of Eurasia. It just wasn't central and top of mind for a lot of people. And so along comes the Belt and Road in 2013 to basically shock people into consciousness, because, to be blunt about it, the Belt and Road emerged at a time when strategic competition with China in a geopolitical and geoeconomic sense was accelerating. And what's more, China's relations with the United States, with Japan, with India, with others, were taking a downturn. And so there's a tendency to imply, I think, that history on connectivity somehow began only in 2013 and only with Xi Jinping, and therefore to subsume the longer history. But more importantly, and this is really what I want to talk about, to forget the United States' own history with some of this connectivity related set of ideas and issues. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. And to just give you a sense of where I'm going, I thought I'd give you a couple headlines at the very top, and then I'll backfill behind the headlines. So the first, obviously, as I'm implying, is that China did not, in fact, invent Asian connectivity. It did not begin only in 2013. It did not spring from the head of Xi Jinping like Athena popping out of Zeus's head. In fact, for 20 years before that, Asia had been, in my view, in the process of being remade into something that looks more like an integrated strategic space that is closer to its historical norm rather than what I would call the historical anomaly of the Cold War period, where subregions of the Asian landmass, East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, really had very little to do with each other strategically, much less economically. And since, as Brantley said in the setup, I was a serving US official working on all three of Asia's major subregions, East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, I got a firsthand look in the decade before the Belt and Road was announced at how some of those connections were beginning to shift activities across these borders and across these subregions. All right, that then leads to the second headline, and I'm going to put this one rather bluntly. In my view, and it's been a theme of a lot of my talking and writing for over a decade, Asians are in various ways passing the United States by. And they are doing that, particularly in the economic fundamentals, by making Asia more Asian again. And I'd summarize that for you this way. The region is becoming, in my view, more Asian than Asia Pacific. It is becoming more continental than subcontinental as South and East Asia become more connected, and more Central Asian than Eurasian as five former Soviet countries that I used to work on basically rediscover that they have Asian roots. And so while many people like to talk, for example, about the United States having an Indo-Pacific strategy, within 3 to 5 years, trade and investment standards for the region are likely to be set by two agreements: the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, neither of which will include the largest economy in the India, and neither of which will include the world's #1 economy, which happens to lie across the Pacific. So what is an Indo-Pacific in the economic realm when you're missing the Indo and you're missing the Pacific? So we're heading in a direction that is going to make the United States a progressively less central player in Asia writ large, unless it stops trying to rewind the clock to 1995 and instead adapts an approach that is more adaptive to some of the new realities that I want to talk about. Okay, so those are the headlines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate these top line points for you in three, we'll call them bites or segments. So first, I want to talk a little bit about why I think America was essentially losing the plot in Asia even before the Belt and Road showed up in 2013. Second, I'm going to try to give you a taste of America's forgotten history on connectivity, because some of you may or may not be familiar with things that happened in the decade before and in the decade even before that, before 2013. And then third, I'll just make a few policy observations that are critical, not necessarily just of the current administration, but of the general structural trajectory over a few administrations. All right, so first bite. Why do I say that America began to lose the plot in Asia about a decade ago? What I would say is that for Washington, the problems have been simultaneously intellectual, strategic, and bureaucratic. Intellectually, for about 60 years, the United States has essentially had three separate foreign policies in Asia. It's had one for East Asia, which now is largely focused on security balancing against China. It's had another for South Asia, which has been much too closely, for my taste, been hooked to the India-Pakistan dynamic. And then it's had a third policy for Central Asia, which the United States has barely regarded as a part of Asia at all. That's like Russia. It's an adjunct to Russia, and therefore has always tended to be an adjunct of Russia policy. And where, frankly, the United States also harbors more than a few Atlanticist dreams tied to Central Asian membership in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and also to the NATO Partnership for Peace, which these countries began to be associated with in the 1990s. So what this means is that Asia is reintegrating, but the United States, intellectually speaking, is too often stuck in this outmoded and still too fragmented way of thinking about its own foreign policy approaches. And that has handicapped creative and, above all, cross-regional policy ideas and responses. All right, so that's the intellectual problem. Strategically, the fact is that old US roles are being challenged by a lot of new forces, particularly what I called before the Asianization of the region. And so, as I said, in East Asia in particular, preferential trade agreements like the ones I just referred to, regionally based regulations and standards, sometimes fragmented by different national standards, for instance, in data governance, where India and Japan have their own set of standards, but sometimes regionally adopted. And institutions and pacts created without American involvement have the potential to marginalize the United States in time, not as a source of capital, not as an investor, not for American companies that want to do business, but as what I would call a standard setter, as a norm giver, a rule writer, and a development, governance, and project finance model. And I'll come back to that because American officials like to always talk about American investment and business. Business is business. Standard setting is standard setting, and American companies can adapt to standards and rules wherever and by whomever they're set. And that's where I think the United States is losing sight of some of its more traditional roles. And then you got Central Asia, where the United States for nearly 2 decades has promoted pipeline diversification away from Russia toward the West across the Caspian Sea, only to have the major new oil and gas pipes from the region go where? Eastward to China. In South Asia, the United States has a strategic partnership with India that's quite impressive, while fading almost everywhere else in South Asia as China assumes a larger role. If you want to see that in action, just take a look at a place like Sri Lanka. The United States is still a major trading partner. It's an investor, but China is the partner of choice for a large-scale capital investment, and it has sustained that role in Sri Lanka across multiple administrations with different ideologies, different domestic political setups that can't stand each other, but have continued to work in various ways to have that relationship continue to evolve. In India, meanwhile, the big infrastructure investor is not the United States, but who? It's been Japan, another Asian country. And Asian countries, by the way, are no longer just capital recipients, they're capital providers. So you have a situation in which Asian money, not just American money, is now flowing around the region. It's looking for yield, especially in emerging and in frontier markets, and supporting project finance models that have really flipped the play, particularly since the 2008 global financial crisis. So that's strategic. And finally, bureaucratically, US institutions, policies, and programs were very skewed for the Asia that I just described to you, at least until recently. So the United States is really not organized for success in a much more integrated Asia. The US traditionally has formulated and implemented its Asia policy through an absolutely baffling mishmash of misaligned agencies and military commands. So on the military side, you've got Pacific Command based in Hawaii that has always handled East Asia and about half of South Asia. Then you got Central Command in Tampa, Florida, that oversees the other half of South Asia, and it's also got Central Asia. In the Obama administration, responsibility for Central Asia was sitting with Russia and Ukraine at the National Security Council. It was sitting with India at the State Department, and it was sitting with China and Japan at the Pentagon. In fact, the United States didn't even treat India as an Asian country until as recently as the 1990s. Up until then, it managed relations with India through a westward, not an eastward looking bureau that was focused primarily on policy in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. So the good news, it seems to me, is that during the Trump administration, and to their credit, there's been some realignment. Pacific Command, for example, has been renamed Indo-Pacific Command. But the bad news is that in that case, for example, that's just basically brought the name of the command into line with what I described to you before, which was the already existing scope of geographic responsibility. PACOM, now called Indo-PACOM, already had responsibility for India and for the Indian Ocean littoral. It just didn't have it reflected in the name. But still, and we can talk about this if you want to talk about India in particular later, there's clearly a much greater recognition, in my view, of the strategic linkages, both actual and potential, between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And that is exactly the kind of thing the United States needs to be thinking about conceptually. And it's much more in keeping with the historical norm, frankly, in Asia. So this is a long way of saying that the United States is still, in my view, not optimally adapted intellectually, strategically, or bureaucratically to something that looks more like Asia's historical norm than what I called the Cold War anomaly. And I want you just conceptually pull this thread out 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years. I will tell you that Asia will not look like it did in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, or even today. And so the United States is at risk of being a backward-looking power in a forward-moving region. We can talk about that a little bit if you'd like. All right, so that brings me to the second bite, which is the Belt and Road, which Xi Jinping laid out in 2013. It is true that China is among the driving forces of connectivity and capital flows and construction and standard setting in Asia and beyond. But I personally have a view, I don't know if Brantley agrees with me, but a lot of the discussion of the Belt and Road I find a little bit breathless, and partly because I think it tends to be somewhat ahistorical. As I said, people woke up in 2013 and discovered some of this connectivity stuff. And it's particularly ahistorical relative to what I said at the outset about prior connectivity initiatives from a greater variety of players in Asia, externally, and also among the international financial institutions, and in both continental and maritime Asia. And so this is where I want to step back and broaden the lens on the Belt and Road per se, to what I said to you earlier was kind of the forgotten history of American connectivity efforts in the region. Okay, so I think I often say the good news about the Belt and Road is that it's woken everybody up, especially in the United States, to this set of issues. Because if you worked on connectivity, particularly in the United States government before 2013, and I did, because I served in the Bush administration, so I left office in January 2009, precisely at the stroke of 12 noon on January 20th, when they make you give up your health and dental and leave your office and get out of town. It was very hard to wrestle people into attention on this set of issues. But the reality is that while a lot of Americans have now woken up to this, a lot of the resulting commentary strikes me as a reaction to the Belt and Road rather than a proactive commentary on connectivity and the degree to which the United States may or may not have interest on that at all. In fact, as I said before, China did not invent Asian connectivity. It's been developing for some 2 decades. It's been the product of the actions and choices of many Asian countries and firms, both on the demand side and on the supply side. In India, for example, most of the major recent infrastructure and capital construction has been financed not by China at all, but by Japan, largely through the Japan Bank for International Cooperation and also through JICA, which is the aid agency, not China, for yen lending. The Delhi Metro, the Mumbai-Delhi Industrial Corridor, high-speed rail for Indian Railways, it's all Japanese capital. So another Asian player, not China, not on the Belt and Road, major economy in Asia. Nor did connectivity as a dynamic process in Asia emerge only in 2013. In fact, it's not an accident, in my view, that China's most successful infrastructure initiatives in Eurasia, particularly in continental Asia, all predate the Belt and Road. And these include oil and gas pipeline projects in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. They included the first onshore production sharing agreement that anyone ever had in Turkmenistan. And all of these were entrained before Xi Jinping came to Beijing, when he was still sitting down in the provinces, and certainly before he'd taken office as the general secretary of the party and the president of China. So the point I'm trying to emphasize to you with this is that other players, but the United States too, actually has some history here. China proposed its version of a so-called New Silk Road. That metaphor we always hear that metaphor, the New Silk Road, in 2013. But before Xi Jinping was talking about a New Silk Road, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was touting her own New Silk Road, and she called it that. And before Clinton began to talk about a New Silk Road, my boss, the Secretary of State in the second term of the Bush administration, Condoleezza Rice, was doing the same thing. And I give you chapter and verse on that because I was there. And in fact, I was the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia with a predominantly China as opposed to Russia-focused professional background, precisely because as early as 2006, which is when I took that job, 6 years before she was in power and 7 years before the Belt and Road, Condi was, as she put it, looking to put the Asia back in Central Asia, because it was already apparent that Central Asian economies in particular were going to have to reorient. The core strategic problem in a region like Central Asia is geography. It's a region that's landlocked. And in the case of one country, Uzbekistan, it's double landlocked. I'll give you a trivia question for your future trivial pursuit. Only 2 countries in the world double landlocked, Uzbekistan, and there's one other that I'll leave to you to guess. So landlocked by landlocked countries. And there's been research, including by the World Bank over the years, that show that if you're landlocked, it can knock as much as 1.5 points off your growth trajectory just because transaction costs are so high for trade and transit. So even then, when Condi would say, put the Asia back in Central Asia, it was obvious that the region looking to reorient from the North and the West to the world's most dynamic economies, which happen to be located to the East and the South, was the long game, both for that region and also where a lot of the capital investment for infrastructure was going to come from. Now, Condi backed up some of that talk, and she did it first by, as I implied to you earlier when I talked about the bureaucratic dimension, reorganizing the State Department so that American foreign policy toward Central Asia would now be managed by an Asia-facing bureau instead of a Russia and European-facing one. And then second, she tried to intensify US engagement with the longstanding connectivity initiatives that are associated with the international financial institutions, and in particular, the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank on roads and power lines, but also a 6-bank, 10-country initiative called the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Program, or CAREC, which had 6 bank members, including the ADB and the World Bank, but also the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Islamic Development Bank, the IMF, and others, and had a lot of the right countries focused on what the CAREC program called 6 connectivity corridors that were designed to link the Mediterranean to East Asia. And if the idea of connectivity corridors sounds familiar to those of you who've heard the Chinese talk about Belt and Road corridors, that is not coincidental, because China has been a longstanding member of the CAREC program, going back to long before there was a Belt and Road, and because China is the #3 shareholder in the Asian Development Bank. So the CAREC program in particular, in the decade prior to the Belt and Road, could be set alongside the ADB's own efforts on roads and the World Bank's efforts around power lines, and that reflects longstanding efforts by the international financial institutions and member governments, both on the supply side but also on the demand side, to focus on this set of issues, particularly in these areas. So in 2007, for example, when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Central Asia, I went off to Brussels and Tokyo, and I proposed to my counterparts an expanded CAREC scheme that would have brought the United States, the European Union, and Japan much more directly into this connectivity mix in Eurasia through an initiative that we called CAREC Plus 3. The aim of that was to garner support for integration from the three major market economies, the United States, the European Union, and Japan, and to do it on market terms that would shape the environment around capital flows to that particular region. Now, ultimately, I flopped at that. The scheme didn't cohere. It didn't cohere because of opposition in Europe. That was born largely out of concern for the Russian reaction. I always thought that was a little silly because the Russians themselves were trying to associate more with the ADB. But what I'm trying to get at for you is the problem I have with when people talk about the Belt and Road or other schemes as this kind of Silk Road, Marco Polo-like connectivity schemes. There's a tendency, I think, to exotify what the Silk Road actually was or wasn't. It's useful, I think, to remember that historically, at least, the Silk Road was not, despite what Xi Jinping or Hillary Clinton like to say when they give these poetic speeches and invoke the metaphor, it was not based on international pacts or treaties the way China does with these bilateral Belt and Road initiatives. It was not based on big meetings like the Belt and Road Forum. It was a much more informal cluster of networks, arrangements, transactions, people flows, and it suffered often because of war and conflict and disruption. So what the Belt and Road does at least represent, I think, and which the US has largely ignored, is a significant ratcheting up of Chinese commitment, resources, ambition, and presumptions about its own centrality in Eurasia, but within a context that's longer of its own history, as I said when I talked about Kazakh oil pipes or Turkmen gas pipes or Turkmen onshore PSAs, but also the longer history that China itself has been involved with through its association with some of these connectivity projects through the international financial institutions. So what's different, I think, is that apart from the kind of eye-popping numbers that you get, you know, Xi Jinping flies into Islamabad and pledges 47, 48 billion. Li Keqiang shows up the Prime Minister of China shows up in some capital somewhere and makes some eye-popping dollar pledge. Apart from that, which gets a lot of the headlines, my own view, and this is where it's a warning to a place like the United States, is that the Belt and Road reflects at least three characteristics that I've always thought that Chinese think they have uniquely among the various financiers like Japan or the US that have pursued connectivity initiatives before 2013. All right, so the first of these is obviously China's very sizable pool of foreign exchange reserves, which has fluctuated, particularly in recent years. There was a period where they were blowing through quite a lot of them, but which has been used by the foreign exchange administrator, SAFE, to capitalize investment vehicles like the Silk Road Fund directly. So there's been the ability to take money right off the top of SAFE and plow it into investment vehicles that are higher yielding than, say, investing in low yielding treasuries. China's blown through some of its reserves since 2013, but my own view is it's still got plenty, and it's got plenty enough to drop meaningful money into certain places in ways that can make a difference on the ground. But that's not the main thing. The main thing are the second and third things. So one of these is China actually has dominant companies in certain areas of infrastructure and construction. And there's a tendency, particularly in the United States, to be dismissive of that because we've gotten accustomed to thinking of Chinese firms as the dominant brands domestically in China because of Chinese protectionism. But more often than not, people will dismiss these firms as peripheral players globally. But how you look at that depends a lot on what you're trying to explain and what sector you're talking about, because it's not the case in some sectors, like, for example, hydropower, which is dominated globally by Sino-Hydro, despite having a very checkered environmental history and a mixed record of managing risk around dams, for example, in Myanmar and Burma. But still, Sino-Hydro, traditionally at least, has been one of the largest and probably the largest builder of dams. I think they had something like a 54% global market share for the world hydro market, even not too long ago. All right, third, and this is the one I've always been most interested in. China is the world's leading consumer of so many technologies and industrial products that it's beginning to leverage sheer market power to export and not simply to consume. So, for instance, I used to, before I came to Carnegie, I directed the Paulson Institute at the University of Chicago. And we sponsored a body of work on the setting of technical and engineering standards. So to give you an example from one of those studies, China's really invested a lot in a technology called ultra high voltage power lines. If you know these are systems that can deliver large base loads over long distances in a fairly stable system. And the fact is that China is now the only country that's really deploying UHV technology on a large scale. And no international UHV standard has prevailed everywhere. And so what that means is that China is positioned, if it leverages its market power to an export role, to internationalize its own UHV standards through contracts and projects. So that first yields greater global market share for Chinese UHV technologies and firms, but it also leverages the Belt and Road to export indigenous engineering standards in an effort to make them default regional and global standards. So technical standard setting could become a very far-reaching legacy of the Belt and Road, because if you build it to your standard. We have a project going at the Carnegie Center in Moscow, for example, on Chinese engineering standards, because they're building so much stuff. Russia's like a giant pilot project for China now. 5G telecoms, power generation systems, even payment systems. And where Russia pushes back or doesn't push back, where China can successfully become the standard setter, that's meaningful. All right, so that brings me to the last part of what I wanted to say, the third bite, and then I'll wrap up because I'm sensitive to the time. But this part is really prescriptive. So if you take everything I just said about what's unique with China, but also the forgotten history, the fact that there are a lot of other Asian players in the mix, but the US is kind of losing the plot, to put it bluntly, because American foreign policy is an interest of mine, having been a serving US official, the United States had better wake up to these facts, and soon, because while China may not, as I said, have invented connectivity, increasingly, I think the United States is a bystander to a lot of these developments. The US, and I've worked on all three regions of Asia, is diplomatically challenged and commercially irrelevant in about 2/3 of the Eurasian landmass. American firms are commercially mostly absent from Central Asia, minus a couple of extractive sectors in one country, Kazakhstan. They're missing in action from most of South Asia, with the exception of India. And I think they're at growing risk of irrelevance in mainland Southeast Asia, minus Vietnam, including even Thailand, where US firms once played a really very central role, which to my mind is quickly becoming more of a Japanese story than an American story. So the point is that as Asia becomes more integrated, the United States will become progressively less relevant in each of Asia's subregions. Now, that's not to say the United States will be irrelevant, because as a security balancer in East Asia, in particular, where China's behavior has just scared everyone silly, from Vietnam to India to the Philippines. The United States isn't going anywhere because there's no basis for collective security in the Pacific until China and Japan have a moment that's analogous to what France and Germany had in Europe. But the security piece is fine, but if the United States wants to do something more than just sail ships and fly aircraft around, then becoming progressively less central across Asia as a standard setting nation raises some serious questions about America's long-term future, to be not just a security public goods provider, but an economic public goods provider as well. And on connectivity and transit issues, the US has been asleep at the switch for a long time. So what I'm trying to do for you here is to try to reframe the American debate, not as a reaction to the Belt and Road, but to step back in light of the longer history of American engagement and say, does the United States actually have an interest in connectivity in Asia, and how does it want to play? And the basic American debate about the Belt and Road is defensive. It's that China has an initiative that aims to lock in a Sino-centric vision of the world through parallel institutions, disruptive initiatives, rewriting of global rules. And that's the beginning, middle, and end of the story, which is fine as it goes. But the way some of the current administration officials in particular question that in public goes a lot further in ways that I think have had a fairly debilitating effect for the US. So to give you a few examples, let's take former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who had a reasonable grasp of history, but an absolutely horrific sense of irony when he gave a speech in Latin America, praised the Monroe Doctrine, and then warned the region to beware of countries' imperial ambitions. He was referring to you-know-who, but the irony was not lost on his audience who were familiar with American history in the region. All right, then you've got our current Secretaries of the Treasury and State, Mr. Mnuchin and Mr. Pompeo, who run around basically cautioning every country against taking money from China. They correctly point out that a lot of Chinese lending lacks transparency, fuels corruption, is environmentally problematic, is problematic on the labor standards, but they then extend that argument to something that sounds more like a rap sheet rather than a bill of indictment that's designed to set higher standards and change practices. Pompeo in particular has been running around warning not just about debt traps, but about asset stripping. And he's doing it not just in places like Sri Lanka, but if you read the New York Times this week, even in Italy, which is not just an OECD country, but a G7 partner. So here's the thing. The Belt and Road can be framed as an attempt to foster dependence on China's economy with strategic effects. And there's a lot, in my view, that's correct about that argument, but it's not the whole story, because given everything that I've been saying to you, most countries don't have the luxury of rejecting Chinese money wholesale. And what's more, China is borrowing and adapting ideas that were advocated by others, including by the United States. And ironically enough, in the decade before the Belt and Road decade, the other foot was wearing the shoe. So when I was doing some of these initiatives that I described to you with my boss, Condi Rice, behind me, it was the Chinese that were bombastically condemning the United States as the schemer for committing the crime of promoting what they called a greater Central Asia, a greater Eurasia, and the evidence for that was infrastructure schemes, policy coordination, project finance across the region. So it's ironic in light of the way the US talks about the Chinese initiatives now. So that context is important, and here I'll move toward the wrap up, because wherever the United States wants to position itself, the reality is from Japan to India to Singapore to Korea, other players in Asia are not willing to opt out and want to be competitive in this space. And so these efforts are gonna matter. What I'm trying to say to you is that the challenge of Chinese activism is more complex than just the Belt and Road being some sort of binary counterpoint to the US. And so my prescriptive view, therefore, would be that the US needs to really enlarge the framing of the strategic problem, which is to say, to move from reacting to the Belt and Road to deciding what its interest is on all of this. Because otherwise, the United States is going to be marginalized on a 7 to 10 year time horizon by an organic process through which Asia is becoming more integrated. And it's happening without American involvement. All right, so let me give you a few final concluding points. My I gave you a top line headline at the top, so I'll give you some top line conclusions at the bottom. My conclusion is that even without the Belt and Road, if it didn't even exist, the United States was already increasingly out of the picture given where Asia's heading. And I think the United States can and should do better, but isn't. For one thing, the US needs much better judgment about where it wants to pick its fights. Let's just take the case of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's not a bilateral set of accumulated bilaterals like the Belt and Road. It's a multilateral development bank. But it was a Chinese initiative. And what happened, as you recall, is that the United States basically went to the mat in a functional area where the existing structures were clearly wanting and insufficient, but the United States had no distinctive model to offer. And so the US took a Chinese proposal of a multilateral development bank and turned it into a bilateral test of wills with a strategic frame, and did it without the leverage to stop the Chinese from moving forward. And then worse, it badly misread the sentiment in nearly every country except India and Canada. And so even some of its closest allies in Europe joined the bank. Oh, and Japan also. All right, so second, you don't want to end up like Don Quixote tilting at the windmills. So it is futile, in my view, for the United States to try to write China out of the story of Asia. And that would be true of any China, not just Xi Jinping's rather assertive and nationalistic China. And so this Pompeo line about not taking Chinese money, in my view, essentially sets the bar at failure. And so there are reasons for that the United States can't overcome. If you want to compete with China that way, you're fighting the map and you're fighting economic gravity. You're fighting the map because China is contiguous to every region of Asia. Just do the map in your head. Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia. So on infrastructure, for instance, you can build a highway from Tajikistan to Western China. You cannot build a bridge from Kyrgyzstan to California. So the United States' role is not analogous to China's, and it has to be therefore the standard setter and the player that leverages uniquely American strengths on behalf of the countries that are on the receiving end. What does that mean? STEM education, access to the capital markets, English language, best-in-class financial services firms and practices, best-in-class engineering standards. Comparing American apples to Chinese oranges is not a competitively successful strategy for the US. So the US shouldn't be trying to battle against every instance of China's effort to foster connectivity, but it also needs to be strategic about the strengths and the uniquely American strengths that it leverages. That's why some of the initiatives I think are welcome. There's this so-called Blue Dot initiative that's designed to set high standards jointly with Japan and in some cases India. It's why the New Development Finance Corporation is a good addition. But in general, I think the US would do better if it worked closely with recipient countries, including of Chinese money, to help them manage and mitigate risk, to extract better terms, assure greater transparency, get to less conditionality, build in stronger anti-corruption disciplines, and so on, than to try to, as I said, tilt at the windmills. So I'll end with this. To compete in geopolitics is not that different than competing in sports, business, or in life. To compete, you got to actually compete. And that means outperforming the competition and not just whining about it. There's a lot of suspicion of Chinese power, money, motives, almost everywhere in Asia and around the world today. And it's growing, which is why China's getting some pushback. But almost nobody has the luxury of opting out of being connected to the second largest economy in the world. So trashing Chinese initiatives while failing to counter and compete with them basically signals to other countries that the United States really only cares about them in the context of its own competition with China and not on their own terms. So the US has an election coming up, as Brantley said when he said go vote. And doing this is going to be hard to do in the context of messages that say America first. So my hope is the next administration, whether it's the second Trump administration or a Biden administration, has the opportunity to step back from this and think about it more as a proactive, interest-based American approach to the whole raft of connectivity-related issues from which the US is being marginalized, rather than just as a defensive reaction where the US is always off the back foot. The United States in general spends way too much time playing defense against China. And as Asia becomes more integrated, my view is the US is going to become progressively less relevant. And so where I'd want to leave you is that the US should just get the heck off the back foot and get on the initiative. And it needs to rediscover some of its own history that I described to you. Because at the end of the day, the best adaptation to Chinese activism is actually a better offense and not to play perpetual defense. And sadly, that's where I see us headed, despite some of the innovations of the last few years. So why don't I stop there? Hope I gave you something to chew on, and I'm happy to take it wherever you want to go with it.
Well, thank you very, very much, Evan. That was a most wide-ranging talk, and let the record show prolonged applause, which is difficult to do on Zoom. And you, not only did you cover a tremendous number of areas, but you also raised all sorts of things that we could discuss further. For instance, how does Russia relate to these developments? Or what about the competition on oil pipelines across Central Asia between China and Japan over the time that you were involved in administration? And then the question that you mentioned at the end of us taking the interest and the sort of the perspective and interest of other countries into consideration, rather than simply having policies derivative from our own interest in our bilateral competition. And I'd say last and most obvious of the big questions that occur to me is connectivity versus decoupling. Decoupling seems to be a strategy that goes exactly, it's circling the wagons rather than heading the wagons toward Asia. And but on the other hand, the decoupling supporters are raising questions of security, which may or may not be exaggerated. So that whole problem is a complex area that affects the degree of possible enthusiasm on engagement in Asia. So what you respond to any part of that while I look at the questions and see where we go from here, okay?
Why don't I take the decoupling thing, because logically and intuitively, decoupling is the opposite of connectivity. It's essentially deconnectivity. And I think decoupling's become a buzzword, but I don't like the term, because I think it misses something essential that gets to some of what I've just been saying. I hate the term decoupling because it implies that the United States and China are in fact a couple. And when you're a couple, you can get divorced. But the United States and China are not in fact a couple, because other countries are going to get a vote on who and how economies around the world are connected to China for flows of goods, capital, people, technology, and data. So I prefer the term deintegration to decoupling. The danger the United States faces in pursuing the kind of approach it is that in its effort to attenuate China's progress, particularly with emerging and foundational technology, that it will sequester so much technology inside the United States, while third and fourth countries find workarounds because they wish to continue to have innovation and commercial relationships with China, that it will attenuate its own innovation ecosystem even as it tries to attenuate China's. And in the short term, you can do a lot of damage to China's progress, but in the long term, I suspect that that's the danger the US faces. When you design an export control system, the metaphor you want to think about is that you have a small yard with a high fence. In other words, you got a small yard drawn around the things that are truly essential to national security with a high fence to protect them. But if you build a yard the size of RFK Stadium in Washington with a high fence, you end up sequestering a lot of stuff. And the core debate the United States hasn't had across the government, and particularly with universities, with businesses, with all of those who have co-innovation partnerships with China, is that in the interest of strategic competition and our national security, how much technology are we prepared to sequester? And what price are we prepared to pay for our own innovation system? The two core trends in the US-China relationship now are what I would call securitization and extraterritorialization. Securitization because economic flows, goods, capital, people, technology, data, largely proceeded on a separate track from the security competition until very recently. But economic integration not only hasn't made security competition go away, it's getting worse. And now security is bleeding back to become the prism through which all those flows are refracted. Why'd the president just try to ban TikTok and WeChat? Because issues of personal data that flow back to Chinese entities. The owner of TikTok is ByteDance, Chinese entity, are viewed through a national security prism. So that's what's lending the fuel to decoupling. But that's the core debate. And the problem is if you bilateralize that, while the kind of connectivity that I described to you in the setup talk continues, you can really continue to isolate the United States. But and this is important, the second thing I said was extraterritorialization. The United States actually has a lot of tools to prevent these third countries from doing certain things with China. And a lot of companies, including TSMC, which is a chip fab in Taiwan, there's a Dutch company called ASML. They make ultraviolet lithography machines for sophisticated semiconductors. They've gotten into the crosshairs of American export controls and have not been able either to sell or to license to units of Huawei or subsidiaries of Huawei, the Chinese telecom leader, these highly sophisticated technologies, because the US can offshore its export controls. So these are the core questions. And I think US policy, the cake is baked. Now, this is the trajectory, and I don't see the US coming off it anytime soon. And the cake is baked in China. China has a much more security-centric view. But I think third countries, it's still, the jury's out. And I think what the US is going to find is it's going to sequester so much stuff that it finds itself actually attenuating some of its own progress in the process. So that's the debate we need to be having, which is not exactly a decoupling debate. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
No, that's very good. That's very good. And the complexities of trying to back off are illustrated by those types of problems with TikTok, et cetera. And I wonder if in the long term you end up creating by the isolation involved, self-isolation involved, you end up creating a boutique economy, an economy that starts missing out on advances made in the rest of the world that is excluded from the US market. So those types of problems. Well, Dale Copeland has a good question about something else, which is the problem of the renminbi not being a convertible currency. Let me read his question. To what extent can China ever achieve a truly global currency, which smaller states in the global south will want to hold as a primary currency reserve? No authoritarian state has ever had a global convertible currency for fear of mass immigration of elites and the middle class. Without it, China may help build infrastructure to gain access to raw materials, but then the countries sell the resources to the US, EU, and Japan. In short, BRI may actually benefit the West via cheap raw materials at China's expense. Without political control, as Russia had with Eastern Europe in the Cold War, China can't control the flow of goods.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think until China's prepared to open up the capital account, this debate about China as a currency leader is largely a bit of a red herring. Most of what China does with the renminbi is trade settlement. Contracts, even Belt and Road contracts, are done in US dollars. Increasingly, China is doing swap agreements between central banks with the PBOC. They're trying to do more in renminbi in terms of contract, the currency in which the contracts are denominated. But until they're prepared to move on a capital account, I really don't see this as ever expanding much beyond trade settlement. So there is the potential someday for the renminbi to become a reserve currency, not the global reserve currency within a basket, but this is a long-term proposition. And I think the resistance to opening the capital account in China stems from a whole variety of structural and domestic political factors that involve loosening up control that for political reasons, the Communist Party has been unwilling and will remain largely unwilling to take on. So I think it's a decidedly long-term proposition. There's a parallel debate emerging around cryptocurrency because the PBOC has been experimenting with digital currencies, thinking about digital currency pilots. Other central banks are starting to take notice of that because they see it as a kind of US dollar workaround. But that too is in a very nascent phase. So I just see the role of the renminbi in all of this largely as a kind of contract denomination and trade settlement vehicle. And that's about it. And I think even most of this, all of this stuff will continue to be priced in dollars.
And I suppose that on the basket possibility, the question is more on the fate of the dollar than on the availability of the renminbi.
I mean, to be honest, there's a long-term debate to be had in China about financial opening because, at a time under Xi Jinping when a lot of reforms are not really moving forward. I mean, I have a dim view of state-owned enterprise reform, for instance, in China and of the trajectory. There are things happening on the financial side. And as somebody in China once said to me, it's not the optimal sequencing for them, but you get reform where you have reformers, and you happen to have more reformers on the financial side. So if you've seen the things they've announced recently, they are opening up new opportunities for foreign financial services firms, which are jumping at the opportunity, notwithstanding this decoupling debate. Actually, financial services are becoming more coupled and these firms are going in. But China has to be prepared to want to attract best-in-class financial services firms from around the world. And that involves loosening up control. The first line of that was lifting the equity caps. China was 17, 18 years after WTO entry in 2001. And the reason the financial services industry had soured on China is because they were still waiting for the equity caps to go. They want 100%. I used to work for Hank Paulson, who ran Goldman Sachs. And Hank used to say, it's hard enough to run a global multinational financial services firm with one corporate culture, much less with two. So why should Goldman be forced into a joint venture? So getting to 100, having 51% doesn't solve that problem. You want 100%. You don't want a joint venture. So China's finally gotten there on the equity caps because they've pledged to provide 100% ownership to foreign firms. But it's been such a struggle to get there that the central bank stuff is a long way off. This is just in the financial services realm for businesses around competition policy. So they're still working that set of issues out.
Very good. Well, here's a different question from Ingya Wang in the sociology department. She says, thank you for your fascinating talk. Given the existing connectivity in Asia, how does the rising role of China reshape the specific ways in which Asia is integrated? Is China pulling connections towards itself or also facilitative of mutual connections among other Asian countries? I think that addresses how the directionality of connectivity might have changed since 2013. And presumably each scenario will generate different implications for the American response.
Right. I think the best way to illustrate this for you, to show you that it's making a difference, is to talk about Central Asia, because it's the region that's the least connected. Least connected to the global economy, least connected to neighboring economies, and least connected to each other. I don't know if any of you have been to Central Asia, but you used to not even be able to fly from one country to another because there were no flights. So you'd find that you would have, if you wanted to go from, Dushanbe in Tajikistan to Tashkent in Uzbekistan, you'd have to fly all the way back to Istanbul in Turkey and then fly back into the region. So you had a highly unconnected region locally, regionally, and globally. China's come in and really reoriented the region. And that's meaningful because historically, most of these countries didn't have to be integrated with each other, much less with the world, because in the Soviet context, most decisions were just made by administrative fiat in Moscow. And so what that meant was that even the easy stuff, crossing a border, sharing water from the upstream countries to the downstream countries, right? Uzbekistan, you have cotton you have cotton agriculture. You had Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which had the water. So very contentious issues. A few years ago, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, seriously, they almost went to war over a water issue. So it was easy when you were part of the Soviet Union because Moscow could decide and then impose. With independence, they suddenly had to broker agreements among themselves on issues where they had no history of doing that and where the rivalries handicapped them from doing that. What's more, the economies were really oriented to sell to and receive investment from Russia and the former Soviet space. So for example, Kazakhstan was the earliest advocate of the Eurasian Economic Community, which many people see as a kind of Russia-centric economic bloc in Eurasia. Former President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan was a big advocate of this. And he was an advocate largely because he saw an opportunity for Kazakhstan to be a regional hub for global multinationals that wanted to use Kazakhstan as the hub to service the entire former Soviet space. And what he didn't count on was Russian non-tariff barriers, which even if the tariff barriers came down are actually quite onerous and were quite onerous for Kazakhstan as well. So the Kazakhs developed some buyer's remorse. All right, so that was the traditional setup. And as I said to you in the talk, you had this fundamental problem of geography, being landlocked, compounded by some of what I'm talking about, with transaction costs going up even higher. All right, along comes China with a dynamic economy to the east, not just a trader, but a lender, a builder, an investor. It's had very profound effects sectorally in sectors like oil and gas, and it's had very profound effects in terms of scrambling the play locally. On the first, back when I was in the government, Turkmenistan was selling basically the Russians through Gazprom had a hammerlock on Turkmen gas. And by having they had a hammerlock because it was basically a Russian monopsony. And the Russians paid the Turkmen something like $130 per 1,000 cubic meters of gas. And the Russians would take the Turkmen gas, use it domestically, and then sell Russian gas to European consumers at much higher prices, which was good for Russia, but not so good for Turkmenistan. So the game for Turkmenistan was bargaining power with Russia by breaking the Russian monopsony. Along come the Chinese, who give the Turkmen, by being another buyer, price bargaining power vis-a-vis Moscow, and also an alternative market for their gas. Now, in the event, we're a decade and a half later, and the Turkmen have swapped a Russian monopsony for a Chinese monopsony, which is not so good for Turkmenistan either. But at the time, it was material, and this is a cone that you can look at in other regions of the world, because it gave that government bargaining power vis-a-vis an external partner that had a hammerlock on them. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which goes to your point about connectivity within the region, is that the Chinese made sure that to bring Turkmen gas to China, because it's not contiguous, you have to build a pipeline. And the pipeline design was designed to cross several borders within Central Asia, including Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and the Chinese had to negotiate the rights across the borders. So forcing cooperation across these borders and building the pipes and sourcing the gas in the upstream was all somewhat new in the region in terms of some of the traditional sets of relationships among them. So whether it was within the region by giving a government bargaining power, within the region by creating a new external market, geographically by reorienting the flow of products from one direction to another direction, on regional issues by brokering cooperation where cooperation didn't exist. or on the hard infrastructure by building the damn thing.
Yep.
That changed. Now, over the longer term, if you follow Central Asian politics, my advice is follow the money, especially in certain countries. And so when you've got money flowing in from one source instead of from another source, it tends to empower a different set of political elites vis-a-vis the prior set of established elites. And it's interesting to look at how Chinese money has had an effect in places like Kyrgyzstan, but also the hostility as China's brought in Chinese labor in certain sets of practices as well. So that's the other side of the ledger. But I think both in terms of fostering connectivity, reorienting connectivity, forcing coordination where coordination didn't exist, and kind of scrambling politics, it's had a very profound effect. Now you can do the same thing in other regions. I want to leave time for other questions, but I'll just give you one example because I think it's on point. All the American whining about the Belt and Road, not every country deals with the Belt and Road in the same way. So if any of you have been in Singapore lately, the last time I was in Singapore, pre-pandemic, you walk around town and you see these signs for Sino-Hydro, which is that big Chinese central state-owned enterprise that I talked about that does hydropower and dam projects. Why Sino-Hydro? Because Sino-Hydro is involved in the tunneling for one of the new subway lines in Singapore. Now, the Chinese may call that Belt and Road. The Singaporeans don't call it Belt and Road. What the Singaporeans call it is a competitive tender in which the Chinese happen to win the bid. So exposing Chinese firms to competitive tenders where they have to bid against other players in a transparent bidding process and where the receiving government sets the bid terms. That's one way among many to deal with some of these projects. Now, if you're sitting in Laos, maybe you can't do that. You don't have as many bidders, you don't have as much interest. It's why it's harder for the US to shape the play in a country like that. It's why I said the US is fading from places like mainland Southeast Asia. But it's why I think US policy really ought to be focused on helping these governments to shape the environment around the contracting and around the transparency. And the US does have the opportunity to do that even when it can't drop $100 billion into a particular region. So I hope that answers your question, but my eye tends to go, if you want to know how connection is changing, go to the least connected places and ask yourself whether and how they're more connected today. And they're clearly more connected, and China's forcing the interconnection. And that's meaningful in my book, strategically and commercially.
That's a great answer because so many different dimensions of connectivity, both beyond the bilateral connectivity and the change in alternatives that countries face once they have a context of alternatives that's different from their original context. In the case of Central Asia, different from just contact to Moscow. That's great. And also, of course, connectivity within China, given China's own scale.
Yeah, in fact, a large percentage of the Belt and Road is being, the projects are, it's being spent in China. It's domestic, and particularly in Western China, it goes back to develop the West.
Right, and they all connect.
2001.
And if that had not happened, if you didn't have the high-speed rail in China, connectivity to the world outside of China would have a very different meaning.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Dale has another question regarding TPP. He says, TPP was designed to counter China's increasing regional economic control through institutions and to make China come to the US on standards and intellectual property rights. If the US were to get back into a new TPP, would this not help maintain economic influence even as it kept up its political influence through alliances?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And I see a question in the chat from Mel Leffler that I'm going to answer. I'm going to connect.
Okay, good.
Okay, so there's a question from Mel that says, maybe I missed the first part of your talk, but could you define US interests with more specificity? So let me start with that, and that'll link to the TPP.
Sure.
I think US interest, I think competing with China particularly in East Asia, it's not rocket science. And it's not rocket science because US interests in the Pacific have been fairly consistent, I think, for a century. It's basically no regional hegemon that could exclude the United States from the region, no exclusionary blocks, a commercial open door and open regionalism, and open navigation on, particularly on commercial sea lanes. And if you think about that set of interests as being consistent, you begin to see what the problem is with withdrawal from TPP and from the agreements that are going to set the standards in the region. Because if what you're worried about is a consistent set of interests around forestalling exclusionary blocks or agreements that might prevent the United States from pursuing its interests in the region, self-exclusion, whether by self-exclusion or exclusion by others, are equally pernicious in terms of pursuing your interests. Now, particularly in the post-World War II period, when I think about American interests in the Pacific, the United States was a leader because it was the principal provider of security-related public goods through alliances, forward deployed military presence, carrier battle groups, all the things that have kept the peace. But also because it was the principal provider of economic related public goods and other benefits. It was the demand for which Asia's export-led economies powered their way to prosperity. And it was the principal driver of standard setting on trade and investment, and on, particularly in the last decade and a half, on liberalization of trade and investment rules. Now, as I said, there's no basis for collective security in the Pacific until China and Japan have kind of a Franco-German moment. And that being the case, the United States was, is, and as far as mine eyes can see, going to remain a major provider of security, directly or indirectly, for almost every country in the Pacific, except for who? Except for China. And so the questions on the security side are really tactical and operational. Investing in partnerships, investing in capabilities, updating alliances, and so on. The real challenges, I think, to American leadership, therefore, come with the erosion of the other pillar, the economic pillar of leadership. And this gets to Dale's question about TPP. Because if the United States was the demand driver, the United States' role as a demand driver in Asia, particularly for East Asian economies, is rising in absolute terms, but shrinking in relative terms. American trade in every part of Asia is going up in absolute terms. It's declining everywhere in relative terms. And that's because the region changed a lot between the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98 and the global financial crisis in 2008. And what's happened is the US demand profile, not just for intermediate demand, but for final demand, is shrinking relatively. And so the US will not be able to rewind the clock to 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, 1960s as such a disproportionate demand driver. That being the case, to sustain economic leadership, the US has to fall back on the other part of its economic leadership, to be the standard setter and the driver on liberalization. But what do I see happening? I see the US, in fact, withdrawing from these agreements, withdrawing from that standard setting role, allowing China to export the engineering standards, TPP and RCEP to set the trade and investment standards. And as an American, I don't think the United States should want to end up as the Hessians of Asia, where we basically sail boats and fly aircraft around the South China Sea while allowing others to set the standards on a pan-Asian basis. The way the debate has evolved in Washington is, as long as the region is not Sino-centric, that's fine with us. A pan-Asian region from which the United States is increasingly excluded, even if it's not Sino-centric, is not necessarily in the American interest, in my view. And where I see the region going is not toward US centrism or China centrism, or to kind of Cold War bipolarity. It's going toward fragmentation. Fragmentation where function will drive form, rather than, as in the Cold War, kind of function with functions then flowing from where you are on the form, whose block you're lined up with. So where trade rules will be set on a pan-Asian basis, data governance is highly fragmented. A lot of people talk about the new India-Japan partnership in the Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister Abe had a G20 initiative around data governance. Guess who declined to sign up? India. They refused to sign up and set their own data standards. So you really have to dig in on a granular basis to function. And when you do, what you find is on the economic pillar of standard setting and leadership, the US is fading. So the solution to that is the one that Dale implied, which is to get back to TPP and to become the standard setter again. But unfortunately, I think the way the politics are set up in the United States, if I were a betting man, I would say that my prediction is the United States will never again do a major multilateral trade agreement. And I predict the United States will not come back to TPP. I talked to a very prominent Southeast Asian the other day who told me that the Chinese are now making noises, not just about trying to get the RCEP done, which is challenging if your timeline is next week, but if your timeline is the next year to year and a half, I predict it will be done. But the Chinese are now also making noises about TPP. Again, not because they're ready, not because they're prepared to make the structural changes that in their domestic economy that would allow them to join, but because TPP membership for China would be attractive because if they were to join, the US is effectively locked out. The politics here are not conducive to the US doing any trade agreement with China, much less joining the equivalent of a free trade agreement that China's party to. So a CPTPP that includes China is not one the United States would be willing to join. And so the strategic implications of China even flirting with it, I think should be viewed more through a political prism than a serious commercial and economic prism. So Dale, I'm with you. I think I'd love to see the next administration come back into it. But the problem is, first, I'm not sure the politics are conducive in either party for that. But second, given the sacrifices these countries made in terms of the changes they had to make domestically, the difficult politics of that, as Brantley knows, as a specialist on Southeast Asia in particular, the current TPP is viewed, I think, by the United States as a floor from which we would negotiate above it in order to facilitate our own joining, but it's viewed in places like Japan largely as the ceiling. It's not the floor. So it's not clear that if the US were not to come back on current terms, which were influenced by the US negotiating text back when Mike Froman was doing it, it's not clear they'd even let the US back in. They'd love to have the US in. But I think all of that kind of militates in favor of the US basically facing the trends I described in my talk. And that troubles me. And by the way, TPP is not a silver bullet. It was a necessary, in my view, but not sufficient condition of what the US needed to do. You'd also want sectoral agreements. You'd want a few strategic bilaterals. You'd want to broker agreements on data governance and in some of the other functions. So that's what I worry about, is just that we've got two Asias. There's kind of security Asia and economic Asia. The US is at the center of one, becoming more marginal in the second, except in terms of business and investment, where it's still quite central, but less so on standard setting. And I don't frankly think that's a sustainable role for the US over the long term. Does that answer those questions?
Unfortunately,
that answered yours.
Unfortunately, it does, Evan. It doesn't answer it with a very optimistic view. But
Sorry.
on the other hand, if we were an Asian audience, we'd probably be more complacent about your outlook than we would be as an American audience. The problem of nostalgia driving policy versus any type of realistic view of a future is certainly a problem. Well, thank you very much for a very wide-ranging, sobering, and forward-looking overview of the relationships of China, Asia, and the United States, and the implications of all of this for the United States. Thank you very much on behalf of the East Asia Center, and I look forward to your next real visit.